I'm going to start by explaining something about what ontology is and what it means to apply ontology. So I guess everyone knows that ontology is an old subdiscipline of philosophy. So Aristotle already was doing ontology. Ontology now is also a branch of computer science. So when we do digital humanities, then we are confronted very often with images like this, with hairballs representing data that we have about many different things, many different subjects, many different people, and so on. So this is a hairball representing data about people who are prominent in the digital humanities, who engage on Twitter. It has no relevance at all to what I say next, but it's an example of the sort of data that we have, which could in principle be used for research. This is an example of political data that we have. This is an example of how different journals make themselves felt, different humanities and social science journals make themselves felt in Twitter again. So there's lots of data like this, and we could in principle use this data for interesting research purposes. And I just mentioned that data like this is being used all the time by people in biology and medicine and similar subjects using ontologies. So what can they do which could also be done with data like this? That's the question or the challenge that I'm going to address. Now, one way of addressing this challenge is to create what are called linked open data. And the idea here is that if you have data about a specific subject, then that will be described using certain terms. And if you can organize these terms into a representation of the data, then you can link it to other such organized representations of data in such a way that you can then reason across the data. You can draw conclusions from it. And these are the areas which form this linked open data cloud. This is basically a happy hunting ground for hackers who like to join data from different areas. So they use the linked open data cloud as a key to combining data. And you can see there's too much of it. It's very unlikely that you're going to create useful connections between data, which you can use for research, unless you're a hacker. So there's no way this can be done easily. So this you can read this. You couldn't read. This is a very early version of the linked open data cloud. Now, many of these modules within the linked open data cloud are ontologies. So there's one up in the right-hand corner called Onto World. I have no idea what that is, but it's an example of this kind of thing that you find in the linked open data cloud. This is an illustration of the freedom of the internet. Anybody can add a new ontology or a new module to the linked open data cloud. So I think the stuff on the left includes music ontologies, for instance. I don't like that because it only works for hackers. It only works for people who are willing to spend their days and their nights trying to glue together very, very large numbers of data representations in useful ways. If you're a hacker and if you know a lot about specific kinds of data, you can get real value from the linked open data and from Datapedia and similar storehouses of data. But I'm not a hacker, and I'm assuming that not everyone on the call is a hacker. And certainly none of us is an expert on many of the areas of data that they might want to relate to. That's the interestingness of new research. You can try to engage with data in areas where you are not an expert. You can't do that with the linked open data method. Now, the ontology method is more general than linked open data. And you can think of an ontology as a computable lexicon, sometimes called a controlled vocabulary. The lexicon represents the types of entities in a given domain where you have data. And the idea is that if people use controlled vocabularies that are public, consensus-based lexical resources, then everybody will be able to find the data they need rather easily because they can look in the catalogs of the controlled vocabularies and they can see where all the data about viruses might be found, or where all the data about Thai politics or Japanese cooking or whatever it might be. If you have controlled vocabularies for each of these areas, then this makes combining data more easy. And so ontology is a method for creating controlled vocabularies of this sort, which are useful both to humans and to people, and both to humans and to computers. So that's what an ontology is, and it happens that UB is probably the world center of ontology, at least measured by our impact and by the number of ontologies which are maintained here, the grant funding that we've been receiving over the years, the number of faculties where we have ontologists working, and so forth. But the origins of ontology go back to the 1980s. And you see the name Tom Gruber here. He is the most famous person in the early stages of ontology. And he's interesting today because he is the inventor of the Siri app in your iPhone, which is based on ontologies. So Siri contains ontologies of restaurants, of movies. This is what an ontology inside Siri looks like. So you have the names of the general types that you want to capture, types like city or state or zip code. And then you have instances of those types, which are the particular cities or states or zip codes where you might find restaurants or movies or whatever it might be. So this is a characteristic split in ontology land. You have ontologies which are about universals, about general types, and then you have particulars, which are the instances of those general types. And the Siri app is constantly growing with more and more data about restaurants and movies and so forth, so that you can work out where you want to eat before you go to a movie tonight. And what we're doing in biology is very similar. So in biology, we have types like virus or coronavirus or SARS virus or COVID-19 virus. These are all types. And then we have many, many instances in all the people who have the corresponding diseases. So there are journals devoted to ontology now. None of these journals existed before the turn of this century. There is a journal of biomedical semantics, which is about ontology of biomedicine. Now, in around the year 2000, with the conclusion of the Human Genome Project, ontologies became really important in biology and in medicine, because the genomic data which was being discovered is just huge sequences of chemical letters of the alphabet. It doesn't have any connection to the biological and medical things which are important, like viruses or diseases or lungs or cell division or any of these other things which belong to the old biology. And the gene ontology, which is by far the most successful ontology in any domain, is an ontology of old biology, which was used systematically to tag sequences, gene sequences, protein sequences, other kinds of sequences. And it thereby made sequence data usable to people who wanted to do old biology or old medicine. In other words, they wanted to study things like diseases. Now, so this is the paper in which the gene ontology was presented to the world. It's been cited some 30,000 times, very influential. And the idea then led to copies. People wanted to have ontologies for other parts of biology and for other areas. So the people around the gene ontology who built these ontologies created an initiative called the OBO Foundry, the Open Biological and Biomedical Ontologies Foundry. I was one of the founders of this foundry. They wanted originally to call it the Smithy, but I vetoed that suggestion. And you can see that the first ontology in the list of OBO Foundry ontologies is called Basic Formal Ontology, This is the top level ontology, which joins all the other ontologies together within the Obo foundry as a whole. That ontology was more or less my creation. That was 20 years ago. And then this is a paper in which we capture the methodology for building consistent ontologies across the whole domain of biomedicine. This is in 2007. Already in that year, the Obo foundry was beginning to show its successes in many areas of biology, and is still doing so. All right, so one way in which these ontologies are used is to tag literature. So the colors here represent tags between phrases in a text and ontologies which have been created for the domains treated in the text. This is a bit like tagging sequence data, but now you're tagging textual data. And so that you can see it more clearly now when I've made the type bigger. So the infection in the top right, which is red, is tagged red because it's tagged by a term from the disease ontology, which is indicated in the list of tabs at the top. All right, so and now we tag sequence data, we tag other kinds of data, we tag clinical notes, we tag literature in the abstract databases, and so on. And thereby we bring together, we create a network out of all of these different kinds of data using ontology. And this is just one of many different kinds of portals which enable you to search through these data stores using ontology and to reason over them in different ways. I'm not going to go into any detail. This works in biology, it works in science generally, because scientists have an incentive to use the same general terms in all the work that they do. Nobody wants to have multiple terms for the same thing in science. That is not the way science works. And the success of modern biology was achieved in large part through the use of common terms to represent chemical symbols, DNA sequences, and so forth. But in the humanities, things are not like that. That there is a much greater independence and creativity in terminological usage in the humanities. And in many cases, terms are not logically defined, and there is no interest in logical definitions because that's not what the humanities are primarily interested in. Humanities science researchers are not doing science in the way that biologists, for instance, are doing science. And also there's a lack of ways of testing whether one or other interpretation of a text is correct. It could be that multiple interpretations are correct, that new interpretations are important precisely because they're new, they throw a new light on what was a text that people thought could be understood in old ways. So that there's a completely different attitude in the humanities. Now, I mentioned basic formal ontology. This is just a fragment of it. It has altogether 35 nodes. These are just a few examples of nodes, and the content doesn't matter. I'm just illustrating the way the system works. One interesting feature of BFO is that it's now an international standard. So this is the first piece of philosophy that is useful enough to deserve being made into an international standard. This took 3 years of my life to get to the point where it's now been approved as an international standard. And that means that in the sciences, but also now in government and administration and such circles, people use BFO and they have confidence that it's been validated by a very strict process. So this is BFO. Now, why is BFO important? Because we can extend it. So this is an extension of BFO into the realm of mental functioning, things like thinking, planning, learning, and so forth. And then we can extend that further to include emotions. So this is a fragment of the emotion ontology. And you see that we have behavioral processes, we have subjective feelings, we have action tendencies. These are all parts of standard ways of viewing emotions. And what the emotion ontology gives you is a controlled vocabulary for describing emotions. And so you can use this controlled vocabulary to tag data coming from different sources, which may be from psychology, but it may also be from literature or history, or it may also be from studying texts, for instance. So this is a consensus-based controlled vocabulary for tagging all kinds of data, all kinds of texts and so on about emotions. And so this is what it looks like. So emotion is based on some sort of appraisal. An appraisal is a kind of cognitive representation. And there are different kinds of appraisals, which are shown around the circle here. So there is an appraisal of social attention, appraisal of loss, appraisal of avoidability, and so forth. Depending on the appraisal, we have a different kind of emotion. Sometimes we have emotions spontaneously and we don't cognitively come to any awareness of the appraisal, but there's an appraisal going on somehow, even if not in this particular moment. And then we have types of physiological response to emotion. So our muscles relax, our muscles become tense, we breathe at a slower rate, we breathe at a more rapid rate, and so on. And so the emotional ontology contains all terms for all of these different kinds of physiological response. And then we have different kinds of feelings, feeling nervous, feeling bad, feeling tired, feeling strong, and so on. These are documented in the emotion ontology in a consensus-based, consistent way. Moreover, for all of these terms, and for all the terms in all of the ontologies, we have human definitions, so natural language definitions, so that human beings can understand what the terms mean. But we also have logical definitions, so that computers can use these terms and as a basis for computational reasoning. All right, now, we can now put different ontologies together. So there is a chemistry ontology called CHEBI. And emotions, as people who like drinking alcohol know, are closely related to chemistry. And so using ontologies, we can build maps of what these relations are. So happiness, for instance, is an emotion. And happiness is in fact part of a certain kind of neurotransmitter receptor activity, which is a gene ontology term. And this neurotransmitter receptor activity is realized, it has as its realizer a certain neurotransmitter, which is called dopamine. So that is linking three ontologies together in order to give an account of what happiness is. Now, whether this is correct or incorrect is not so important. What is important is to see how ontologies can enable you to link data of quite different sorts in a consistent way. And this is another story about sadness. I don't think I will go into this, but you get the idea. Depression is realized in a certain kind of sadness, which has as part the downregulation of the dopaminergic system. All right, now we can apply this, for instance, to sentiment profiles for religious texts. We have a canonical vocabulary for describing emotions or sentiments, and we can use this vocabulary to map certain features of, for instance, religious texts. So here the Quran is in pink and the Bible is in blue, and you can see that in these areas, they're pretty much the same. But so, for instance, joy and anger are very highly expressed in both the Bible and in the Quran. But here they disagree. So the Quran emphasizes much more trust and fear and somewhat more fear and anxiety relative to the Bible. All right, so the emotion ontology lives on the web. You can find it on the Bio portal, which is a repository of ontologies. There are other such repositories. It's updated slowly by experts, such as me, for instance, and it's tested in various different kinds of applications, for instance, applications to understanding how people respond to lectures. You can have them tick how they feel at certain times during the lecture using an app created on the basis of the emotion ontology. So now BFO is much more widely accepted now than it was when it first arose within the OBO foundry research. It's now used in some 350 ontology efforts, many of which are in biology and medicine, but some of which are in other kinds of areas, and I'll illustrate some of these in a minute. So the interesting thing is that many of these ontologies are created or co-created or co-managed here in Buffalo. So this is just a few of those. We have the collaborative behavior ontology. We have a suite of common core ontologies, which are designed to cover a huge array of areas such as nations, politics, law, government administration, and so on and so on. Then, as you can see, we have the coronavirus infectious disease ontology, which is part of a whole suite of infectious disease ontologies, we've been building here with collaborators in other universities for some 10 years now. We have a document act ontology, which is about, for instance, the ways in which we use legal documents in order to perform certain acts of signing or filling in or amending and so forth. You've seen the emotion ontology. We also have the environment ontology, and at the very bottom, you see the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals ontology that is based in large part on the environment ontology. Then we have the information artifact ontology, which is a kind of ontologization of what the Dublin core is trying to do with bibliographic and bibliometric terms. And then we have some more disease ontologies, pain, and so forth. So there are people in, I think, 4 faculties at UB who are working on ontologies. We have people in engineering, people in the dental school, people in the medical school, people in the management school, and then we have people in College of Arts and Sciences. Many of them are working directly with me, or they're my students. Some of them have come to Buffalo independently and then discovered ontology. And I'm hoping that in the humanities, digital humanities field, we can find new opportunities for collaborations of this sort. All right, now there's also a book which I wrote with 2 former students, which is a guidebook to building. Well, you can see what it's a guidebook for. Now, let's talk a little bit about what it means to have an international standard. So the International Standards Organization and the International Electrotechnical Commission have a joint technical committee, which was the committee which was responsible for the BFO standard. And one of the things that they do is world plugs. So if you travel, which some people used to do in the olden times, you need to carry plugs, and it's good to know that the plugs that you carry will fit. And so the International Electrotechnical Commission ensures that there is a relatively small number of options for plugs of any given type. So these are the areas of the globe in which the different types of plugs are used. And this is a better map. So you see most of them use the same kind of plug, but not the United States nor the United Kingdom, both of whom are outliers. Basically, the English-speaking world is an outlier. These are the countries using plugs and sockets of type E. And so it goes on like this. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is because that's what we do when we maintain a library. So the Dublin Core, and before that, the Library of Congress, had various different kinds of information that they needed to fit with other kinds of information. And gradually, as the computer became more important to the workings of a library, it was necessary to make these various different types of information fit together. And that's what the Dublin Core tries to do. Now, the Dublin Core is an example of an ontology. It's a very widely used ontology. It doesn't have all the qualities that an ontology can have. So it can't support logical reasoning the way that, for instance, the gene ontology or the emotion ontology can. But still, it's an ontology, and it's an ontology which is standardized over many libraries and helps to make sure the different kinds of information fit but also that you can find different kinds of information more easily because they've been standardized in their typology. All right, now I did something similar, again with actually the former collaborator, for philosophy, so creating an ontology of philosophy, viewing philosophy now in the old-fashioned sense according to which philosophy is part of the humanities. So what would such an ontology look like? Well, first of all, we can look at the relations which join together the main kinds of entity, the main types in the philosophical field. So we have philosophers who are persons, and then we have groups of philosophers, and then we have the concepts which those philosophers engage with, and then we have fields and philosophical entities more generally. And now there are relations between them. So a person can be a member of a group. One group can be a subgroup of another group. A person or a group can work on a concept, and a person or a group can be active in a field, and so on. So this is not rocket science. This is just trying to make things fit clearly so that you can keep track of the data that you have in a consistent way. So these are some examples of relations in the phil-onto. So Kant is an instance of philosopher, and concept is a subcategory of philosophical entity, and so on. And then the bottom line here, disjoint, concept, proposition, and so forth. That means that no concept is a proposition, no proposition is a concept, no concept is a theory, no theory is a concept, and so on. And then philosophy as a whole is the all-encompassing philosophical field. So every philosophy is a part, every philosophical field is a part of the all-encompassing philosophical field called philosophy. Now, you can't see all of this, but once we start building the ontology, it gets very big. So because we have all these subfields, so if you imagine a gigantic extended graph with philosophy at the top, and then you have all of these various subfields below it. So this is just the graph of the subfields of philosophy. Then we have geographic areas, because philosophers lived in certain areas at certain times and in certain parts of the globe. And so we organize the ontology in such a way that we can capture these kinds of information too. And that's a very, very simple part of the historical period and geographical area treatments of the ontology. And so we can say that Plato is a metaphysician who worked on these arguments here listed down the right-hand side. He was a realist about forms. He was an ancient Greek philosopher, and ancient Greek philosophers is part of both ancient philosophers and Greek philosophers. So what can we do with this? Well, we have a map of all philosophers, or all philosophers who were listed. I'll explain where this map comes from in a minute. So if you imagine every dot on this map is a philosopher, the dots in the middle of the little cycles here are the supervisors, the PhD supervisors of the people on the edges of the ring. So truly influential people have big rings of followers around them. And every dot is a person who is an instance of the type philosopher. And this is the same information now expressed as a list rather than as a big graph. So this is the Leibniz lineage. Peter Hare was the chair of the philosophy department here at UB for many years, and he is part of the Leibniz lineage in the sense that there is a line from Peter Hare through his supervisor all the way back to Leibniz. This is a bit of a cheat because Leibniz was not, in fact, the doctoral supervisor at Bernoulli. They didn't really have the supervisor system in 1663. But leaving aside that wrinkle, this is a picture of the doctor-father-student relation. This is the Menke lineage, which is less interesting, but it includes the immediate former chair of UB, namely David Hirschenoff. And this is the vice lineage, which is also less interesting than the Leibniz lineage, but which includes me, and so forth. Now this is all right. And now we have subtypes of philosopher. And you can see how complicated this graph is going to get once we organize it carefully and represent it. But still, it's not difficult to do this kind of work. There will be some overlaps which will be difficult, but in general, we can get a lot of the easy parts done very quickly. And then we can create relations like I illustrated before. Now, the big graph that I showed you and the tab lists forms something called the philosophy family tree, which it describes itself as an academic genealogy of philosophers based on this link of Dr. Supervisor. And they have 140,000 entries, mostly from 1930. And so we can annotate this entire tree with information. So Plato worked on the third man argument. So we can, this is a picture so you can see a little bit more of the structure. And the boxes with the green and blue, these have turquoise, I guess. Those lines inside them are actually the names of the philosophers. If you continue to zoom in, you can actually read the names. So here you can read them. Now, there are other people who've attempted to create such graphs of philosophy. This is a rather interesting one. So you can see that he divides epochs in something like the way that we get if we chain back through the graph of the philosophy family tree. And this is what it looks like when you focus in on those epochs. And I was the editor of the Monists for some time, which was founded by a gentleman called Paul Keras. And I've worked on these figures in the olden days when I used to do the history of philosophy. So Plato worked on the third man argument. Other people worked on the third man argument, so we can link them. And we can identify philosophical fields, for instance, feminist philosophy of science, by identifying within the tree all those philosophers who worked on feminist philosophy of science or are working on feminist philosophy of science. And similarly with philosophical groups, with epochs. And now we can use this tagged data. So we know many things about the people who are marked here as working within this epoch. We know what problems they worked on, we know what fields they belong to, we know what groups they belong to, and so forth. We can use that tagged data in order to do semantically enhanced publishing. In other words, to create tagged versions of philosophical texts, articles or books or manuscripts, along the same lines as we tagged biological texts using ontologies earlier on in this talk. All right, now as I say, I have made some contributions to the humanities in my ontological role, and one of them was published in this volume called Thinking Through Digital Technology in the Humanities and the Arts. And the title of the paper, you can see, I co-authored it with a colleague here in Buffalo called Werner Koisters, who is, well, I don't dance at all, and so he is a much better dancer than me. He's also the division chief of the Division of Biomedical Ontology in the UB Department of Biomedical Informatics. This is the only academic unit in the world which has ontology in its title. And this is what he looks like when he's dancing. And the issue is, how do you define a half cut in Irish? Well, how do you even pronounce Seanos dancing? That's what we had to do in order to create the ontology of dancing. That's the definition. So it's not a short movement of one lower leg crossing the other leg with the foot pointing forward, because if I do that while standing in a bus queue, I'm not performing a half cut. I'm just moving my legs. So in order to be a half cut, It has to be part of a dance, which is a certain cultural phenomenon. It can't be an epileptic jerk, or it can't be kicking a football. So the ontology of dance is more than an ontology of movement, and it's more than an ontology of legs and feet and so forth. Although these have to be in the ontology, we take them from the foundational model of anatomy, which is the standard anatomy ontology. But we need more than that. We need also the culture of dance, the music which dance is associated with, and so forth. And then we need to use the ontology to tag instance data. And why would we do that? Well, this is a question of history, discoverability. So there are many, many pieces of data relating to choreography, dress patterns, music, and so on, associated with dance in the course of history. And some of this is in the form of literature, and some of it is in Spanish, some of it is in English, some of it is in Latin, and so forth. And so in order to discover what the precursors of the quadrille of 20th century Appalachian square dance, what the precursors are in the 17th century English quadrille, we need to have a controlled vocabulary which allows us to find the relevant sources. And this actually is required by the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, that we have to support the conditions for necessary for cultural reproduction. That means we have to be able to understand descriptions of dances in ancient texts in ways which modern users of language will be able to understand. And that's exactly the kind of thing which an ontology is designed to support. Okay, so what do? We build the dansome, which is like the genome, but it's a collection of all the data we have from any field pertaining to the history of dance, including journalism, fiction history, biographies, and paintings, photographs, videos, and so forth. All of those things can be collected, and then they can be linked together by means of the ontology, and we can do reasoning across all the data by using the logical facilities which the ontology provides. We can discover things that we didn't know about by using the ontology, the facilities which the ontology provides, and so forth. Now that's 110 slides, which is not bad, but I think I'm going to stop there. So we also need a music ontology, dress ontology. We have the body part ontology, but we need a body part movement ontology. And then of course the dance ontology will be related to the emotion ontology for obvious reasons. But now I really will stop.